Well, look, Di, essentially I'm a mentor, but what I'm actually known for is building B-suite leaders with C-suite impact, and we're going to get into that today. My passion, I suppose, is helping leaders have more impact more easily from the center, from the heart of an organization. And that's what I do for a day job, so lucky me, right? My true passion, however, is Maltesers. There is nothing I will not do for those small, brown, shiny things. I also have a secret fail-safe parallel parking formula, which is so remarkable that people often say something when I get out of the car. It's that good. And I'm just finishing my second book, which should hit the book sales in September 2025.
Hey, I'm Di Gillett, and this is the Power of Women podcast. We're a platform that showcases and celebrates the strength, resilience, and achievements of women from all walks of life. And that includes the women leading from the middle, those holding the teams together, navigating constant change, and often doing it without the recognition or the support that they deserve. Middle managers are under pressure like never before because they are squeezed by flattened structures, potentially sidelined by AI hype, which we're going to get into today, and battling burnout at alarming rates. And as you'll know if you've listened to the Power of Women podcast previously, burnout just comes through again and again and again. But coming back to middle managers, what if we've been looking at them all wrong? In this episode, I'm joined by Rebecca Houghton, Australia's leading expert on middle management and the founder of BoldHR. And with data from over 1,000 managers and a sharp lens on the trends reshaping the workplace, Rebecca explains why middle managers aren't obsolete. In fact, they're evolving. If you're leading from the middle or relying on those who do, this conversation might just change the way you see the most overlooked layer in leadership. Rebecca Houghton, welcome to the Power of Women podcast.
Thank you, Di. It's absolutely awesome to be here. And can I just say, that is one of the nicest, most accurate summations I've heard about the state of middle management right now. So thank you for preparing
Thank
that.
you. I'll take that. I'll take that. So let's start with, if we could, Rebecca, you've said middle managers are the invisible glue of organisations, but are the most at risk. Just how big is that cohort? If we look at Australia and globally, what's the middle management cohort look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually one of the first questions I looked into when I decided this was my lifelong practice. And it's impossible to dimension. What we do know are a couple of really important factors, however, that are worth thinking about. When we think about who is a middle manager, effectively, if you've got a leader above you and a leader below you, then you are a middle manager. We know that they're responsible for over 90% of the workforce, directly or indirectly. And we do know that in the USA alone, 10,000 of them are retiring per day right now. And that came from Forbes. So what we can extrapolate, from an ABS perspective here in Australia, is that we're losing around 500 a day, which gives us an average cohort of about 95. So, it's difficult to pin down, but any organisation you've been in has got middle managers, whether it's a tiny little tech startup or whether it's a massive, great big enterprise brand name. If there's a manager above you, a manager below you, you are a middle manager. And the chances are you're responsible for 90% of what goes on in your organisation day to day. It's a big responsibility.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting dimension. So what drew you to focus so intently on this middle layer? Because in essence, all the attention seems to be at the top.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Well, there's actually two reasons, two defining moments in my career that really brought me here. One of them was deeply personal and kind of weird, and it has a witch involved.
Go on, tell us about it.
The other one's pretty strategic, Di. That's the one I want to tell you.
Okay.
So look, at a personal level, I got married in France about 20 years ago. You think I would know? I don't know. And the day after my wedding day, I was burned so severely that I was hospitalised at Tripod in Bordeaux, and hospitalised for a month. So 13 general anaesthetics, 3 skin grafts, digging out things on my arm with a spoon. It was, 30% of my body in bandages. It was not a great honeymoon for my poor husband. I had the benefit of lots of morphine. He didn't. I hadn't seen my face for about 3 weeks. Nobody had. And it wasn't looking particularly fabulous. And that is where the witch comes in. So she saved my face. It is a true story. It probably requires wine.
I'm glad you said that's where the witch came in. It wasn't the burnt part.
No.
This is a good thing.
No. Well, we live in a very, very small village in France, and the villagers rallied around and bought the local healer. And I'm not a big believer in that sort of stuff. I'm not superstitious. I don't have faith. But I would be prepared to change my mind, because that experience was inexplicable, to the point that when I went back to Tripod, to the hospital, which luckily for us was the best burns unit in the world at the time, my surgeon, who's this little French guy with a twiddly little moustache, quite tiny, bald head, literally took the bandages off my face, danced around the room, pronounced himself a genius, and ran outside to get other people to come and look at me and take photographs. So the thing that she'd done, before she sort of passed out with the effort when she was working on me, was she said that I can only save her face. So the rest of my body, it's not quite this lucky. Yeah. So yes, there was a witch. Anyway, I'll go back to why middle managers.
Please do.
I get back to work, back to Australia. I'm getting my balance back, and my employer, for whom I'd built multi-million-dollar businesses over the last sort of 3 years when we were together, pulled me in for a little bit of a chat. I thought the chat was going to be, how's your recovery going? Actually, the chat was, you've taken too many days off work now, we need to start docking your pay. That conversation, I'll be honest, hurt more than the burns did. I felt...
I can imagine. Tell me, was that was the recruitment industry?
It was.
Yeah, that resonates.
Yeah, and it's a funny one, because you do sit there and after the initial shock, right, I'm kind of British, so I open my mouth, close my mouth, walk away and think about it. I don't react in the moment often. I often wish I did, but that made me feel incredibly disposable. It really showed me that we had a very one-way relationship, that the overtime hours and the weekend work and the late nights weren't registering, but the minute that I needed a couple of days off for a couple of months, that did register, and it registered really quickly. I think I was back for like 2 weeks. So that was quite diminishing, I suppose, from going from a super high performer that thought they were a real asset to being quite a disposable asset.
And sadly, I have a feeling that scenario, albeit the backstory, will resonate with so many people listening.
Look, I think it really, really does. I think the middle management experience sucks. It really sucks. You're not seen as valuable. You're not valued. And we'll go through, there's a million stats that proves that. It's not just an emotional statement. And I feel like middle managers are doing it way tougher than is reasonable or rational. So I think, that might have been a trigger point for me to start thinking about, why do we treat our middle managers that way? When we know that there are a group of people who are hyper accountable, high performers, drive themselves really hard, commit longer hours and more emotion and more effort than just about any other workforce, and yet they're more disposable than just about any other workforce. For me, at an emotional level, that makes no sense.
Well, it's the layer that gets cut, isn't it? Every time there's a rationalisation or a transformation, it's where the knife goes.
Yeah. That's exactly right. It seems to be the easiest, the management consultant answer. Draw a red line through that layer and our job here is done. Well, actually, it was interesting, because it was during a pretty massive transformation that the second moment sort of happened to me that really concreted where I wanted to play. And that was when I was head of talent for Australia Post. And in that job, you've got a lovely broad view of the world. You can sort of see all the moving parts when you're that senior. And one of the things that I noticed was this pattern where, when we were investing in various projects and programs to completely transform the organisation from letters to parcels, effectively, one of the things that we really started to pick up was where we'd really engaged the middle manager early, and really skilled them up and brought them into the story early, those projects were outperforming. Where we weren't bringing them into the tent early, where we were treating them just like a communication channel, those projects were failing, and disproportionately at both ends of that spectrum.
And the numbers would have been enough to really get good data on that.
Great data. Yeah, absolutely great data. You know, you're running hundreds of millions of dollars worth of programs that are there to save an iconic organization. It was an existential period. There's no question about it. So for us, we're watching very, very closely. And this sort of forced multiplier factor, when you start looking at this one player in the room that makes such a big difference. My next question was, great, what are we doing to invest in that and magnify that further so that we get that multiplier effect all the time? And we went and had a look at the learning and development budget. And as you can probably predict, the numbers were terrible. Yeah, so less than 10% of the leadership development funding went to middle managers.
So it's no wonder you've landed where you've landed, and your focus is, because it will feel like the great ignored.
It does. Yeah, it does. And I think not just the great ignored, but actually, the
least loved.
Pop rocks, we love to hate them, actually, don't we? We love to hate them. I mean, how many members of the workforce have entire comedy series dedicated to them in 3 countries across the world? How many of us have a regular fixture in the Financial Times cartoon strip, since the 80s, dedicated entirely to how much we hate middle managers? So it's not just organisational disposability. It's not just this ignorance and this apathy towards middle management. There's actually a pop vox dislike. Society doesn't like middle managers. And I think that's a bit unfair, really.
Yeah, I do too. I agree. So if we delve in a bit further, because you talk about unbossing and the great flattening, and I know they are phrases that are used across the marketplace. Can you just put some context around what those two terms actually refer to?
Yes. Yes, let's not get overexcited about them. They are not new. I'm sure a lot of people do, but I think anything that starts with the great something when it comes to a talent trend needs to be treated with caution and slight cynicism. So look, unbossing really is reducing the number of managers in an organisation. You will have heard Zuckerberg saying, I don't want managers managing the people who do the work. I get it. When people present it like that, of course it makes sense. The great flattening is exactly the same thing. It's really that thing that we've done since the 50s, which is reducing the layers of an organisation and increasing the span of control. So increasing the number of direct reports per manager. At its heart, that's what it is. What's quite interesting, though, is it's not new at all. We've been doing this on and off since the 50s. We started kind of brand naming it in about 2008. So Project Oxygen came out with an experiment. It was a brilliant experiment, which at its heart was, what can we do away with middle managers? Their answer after that experiment, Project Oxygen, was no. So they brought them back. People very quickly lost their way, lost their purpose, and couldn't argue their way through to making a decision without a middle manager. Zappos in 2013 introduced something called the holacracy, which is an even sexier word than the great flattening, but it's kind of what it meant. Self-managed teams, no middle managers. And surprisingly found pretty much exactly the same things that Google did and quietly brought them back again. I think they were all back in place by 2018.
So how much of that really results in reducing salary overhead, because if you're not management, you're paid at a lower level, and then the flip side of that being you've got no pipeline coming through to your senior management structure, because the gap from minion, I'll call it, for want of just articulating a level, through to senior management has no growth in between, and the step is a step too far.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Di. The people who are beginning to spot it, the people who are calling me are board members who are seeing this problem, and their concern is who's going to be our C-suite in 10 years' time. now. Whether you believe that AI will be your CEO in future, we can get into that in a minute, but
we will get to that.
What we do know is there is a bit of a pipeline crisis. We're still running big businesses as if the promotion ladder is the right way to motivate people to perform. And what we're seeing is a really distinct step away from any interest in the ladder. So Perkbox in the UK proved that only 4% of today's workforce have executive aspirations. The BoldHR B-Suite benchmarks that we ran shows that only 14% of existing leaders want to be promoted further than where they are. These are not great stats when you're looking at a pipeline of future leaders.
Does working from home play into that? Is that dampening the leadership aspiration because they're not in place?
That's a great question. I think that the Gen Z leaders who kind of grew up and cut their teeth leading from home, they've probably they have had a really horrific leadership experience. Nobody to learn from, no mentor watching and observing you. Your team's going through a rough ride. You're going through it too. You're a human and you're trying to hold it all together from your front room. That's the worst introduction to leadership that I think anyone's pretty much ever had in the history of leadership. And it's no surprise that there is virtually zero interest in furthering their leadership career coming out of that cohort. They are underconfident and uninterested in leadership, full stop. I'm not so sure it works for the rest of us though. So I think for people who have had, who were already seasoned leaders, and most middle managers today were then, really knew their way around their team, knew how to motivate people, ask the right questions. The switch to a screen, the little talking head, wasn't that crippling for their leadership experience, for their leadership aspirations. I think what's become crippling is actually the job, not the circumstances of doing the job. Gartner comes out and says that middle managers have 50% more work than they could possibly do. So it's a hiding for nothing. It's a flogging. And I think leaders are looking at the workload, the stress levels, and the reward mechanisms that are all about promotion, and fewer and fewer people are interested in that, and it's just not adding up for them anymore.
But that Gartner view is exactly what your experience was. You would have been, for the trigger point for you to change careers and run your own business, because you would have been the one generating the revenue, getting flogged, and then getting the spanking for your efforts, really.
Pretty much. I mean, the more senior I became and, post that really horrible experience, when I was working for Australia Post, for example, that sense of disposability and invisibility actually starts to dissipate. And it's quite interesting. When we did some research on things like burnout, we noticed that it was much worse in the middle than it is at the end. As you become more senior, there are some other associations that help you move out of the crunch that is true middle management. So that was something that I'm reflecting on. So
is that telling you that middle managers are working harder than the next level, or that they just don't have the coping mechanisms?
Controversial.
I know.
Harder.
Let's go there.
Look, there is more. So I think what happens, what we know from the research, what happens is that more junior middle managers don't have the same level of expectation, responsibility, and performance drive that the more seasoned middle managers have. So more junior middle managers, early middle managers, tend to have a much lower stress level, much lower working, the better work-life balance. Then at the very senior end, at the C-suite, so when you're really looking at that top end of the chart, we're also seeing the same behaviours. We're seeing people saying the work is not totally manageable. They're not sitting there, drinking pina coladas in the sunshine thinking about work all day. They're doing work, and it is a hard job to be a C-suite leader. But the level of stress and the hours that are associated with that job are not the same as those associated with being in the middle.
So if the ladder to C-suite isn't as motivating as it once was, What is the goal and the ambition of middle managers now?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I think we've overlooked this, or we've made assumptions about this. And if you think about, the way we talk about middle management, it's often as if it's just a stepping stone to becoming a C-suite leader.
Can't be. Gets pointier at the top. There's less roles.
Correct. There's also quite a lot of press that assumes that middle managers, many middle managers, because of that reduction in opportunities at the top, therefore many middle managers are failed C-suite wannabes. They're either on their way up or they kind of got bounced back down. Now, actually, neither of those things are true. Most middle managers that we work with love their job. They want to excel in role. They want to be proud of being a middle manager. I promise you there's no child in middle school right now saying, when I grow up, I want to be a middle manager. But why not? Right? I think it's, but for me, middle management has never been a career destination. Never. And yet, these are very senior, very well paid, highly accountable, hugely powerful, influential people when they choose to be. But they're not on the radar for your career when you're 15, 16 years old.
And you could not be more right. I mean, you hear people espousing the view of I want to be an MD, I want to be a CEO one day. And the term middle is the issue, because it implies mediocrity, and nobody's saying that's where I aspire to be. But there's a lot of reasons why one should aspire to be at that level, because that's the engine room.
It is. It really, really is, Di. You think about where do we think the C-suite get their ideas from? Who do you think does the initial decision making to filter up the best ideas to them, to the best decisions to them? Who influences them to make the decisions that they do? Who does the research to give them the confidence that they're going in the right direction? It's all middle managers. This invisible, neglected group.
What's really getting in the way of them being effective and challenging their energy now? What's the biggest drawback for a middle manager? Yeah,
the biggest problem is one we know, and you've raised it already, Di. Burnout is absolutely rife in middle management. We know, so we look at the four big challenges that are in middle managers' way. Burnout sits at nearly 40% of all middle managers would claim that burnout is their number one barrier to getting the job done, to enjoying the job more, to achieving more with less. Influence sits at about 30%, and I think there's a really strong relationship between the two. Confidence sits at about 20%.
One causes the other.
Yeah, and career ready sits at 14. So only 14 people care about that progression piece. That's not what's in their way. More seniority is not in their way. The workload and the burnout associated with not just the volume of work, but the expectations that go along with the volume of work.
Yep. And then the lack of influence causes the burnout, and it's a vicious circle.
Exactly right. Yeah. Exactly right. And it is a vicious circle. And that really, for me, is the area that we need to solve for. So when I'm talking to corporations, I advise corporates and I work with individual managers. When I'm talking to the corporates, one of the things that I really talk to them about is whether they've got the definition of role right for middle managers, because what will often happen is that the workforce, who are quite well protected by various agreements and unions and etc., have quite good control over the boundaries of their job. The C-suite, because they were defined in the 70s as being strategic visionary leaders, have quite good boundaries over the outsides of their role. Everything else is a middle manager's job, everything. So whether it's admin, whether it's strategy, whether it's coaching somebody, it doesn't matter. It just all gets thrown into this bucket in the middle that's called a middle manager. So it's no surprise that they're burning out.
Well, what we're going to do is we're actually going to take a break, which is what middle managers don't do or don't get to do. And when we come back, Rebecca, let's talk about how one's reframed the middle management, or how, in fact, you've reframed the middle management. And let's talk about the elephant in the room being AI. If you're loving the Power of Women podcasts, be sure to jump on to our YouTube channel and hit that subscribe button to ensure you never miss an episode. So, Rebecca, I I've been in a complementary world to yours for decades, leading into my segue into the Power of Women podcast. And you've coined a term, the B-suite, which I can't believe hadn't actually been coined before, because it's brilliant. But what exactly is that point of difference between the B-suite, which I'm going to assume is middle management, to how the rest of the marketplace and managers are referred to?
Yeah, great question. And the definition is really important. I think when I came into this space, one of the things that I wanted to do away with was that middle manager brand. I love the fact that you called out that even the word middle is mediocre. There's just a horrible association that we really need to shed. The reality is some people are doing middle management badly. That's the reality. Some people are doing it with far more impact. They're working with far more influence despite not having more seniority. And that different breed, that's what we want to manufacture more of. So that's a B-suite leader, to differentiate them from middle managers. And the benchmarking that we produced last year when we profiled 1,001 middle managers die. How annoying. 1,001. Yeah. When we profiled those 1,001 middle managers, what we discovered was where the average middle manager sits according to their hierarchical level, their performance based on hierarchy, and where B-suite leaders operate. And there is an 18-point difference between the two. So statistically very different in terms of the impact and the maturity that they bring to their role, even if their role is paid the same and at the same level in the org chart. And that's really what we are striving for, is how do we not worry about promotion? We know that's no longer appealing. How do we focus on impact without authority? How do we have that influence from the center of an organization that isn't tied up with seniority, but still allows you to be more mature, more influential, more effective, more like a C-suite leader?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the B-suite should become the cohort who are the pipeline into C-suite because they're an elevated level within the middle.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, when we first set out to build B-suite leaders with C-suite impact, through our programs and all the stuff that we do, one of the things that was an accidental outcome was the promotion rate. So we knew when people came into the programs, we would ask them, what is it you want out of the program? Is it a promotion? And exactly like our research says, somewhere between 15 and 20% of people said yes. Most people said no.
That's incredible.
It's amazing.
Is that, 15 to 20%?
Yeah. So only really, I would say if you're looking at your middle management cohort right now, 1 in 5 of them are actively interested in a promotion. And only 1 in 5 of them is actually worthy of a promotion, and the odds are they're not the same person.
I mean, that's natural attrition at its best, given, as we've already said, it's pointier at the top and less of those opportunities. But it's extraordinary that in some Darwinian way it's actually become that in reality.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things that has really surprised us through the programs, and it taps into what you've said straight away, is do B-suite leaders become the automatic pipeline for C-suite leaders? The answer is actually yes. Despite their preference to not be promoted, the outcome of these programs has tripled the promotion likelihood. Now, some of that is because they start to see what they can achieve in themselves in the middle and start to observe how they could achieve more with more hierarchical authority. Some of that is because they become more visible, and that is one of the big drivers of seniority. So I think there's a little bit of changing their own mind in terms of what they want, and the organisation changing their mind in terms of what they see. But that wasn't what we intended in the first place. We were really committed to more impact from the centre. This has been an accidental but very happy outcome.
Yeah. So when you go into an organisation and pitch this program around B-suite, my assumption is the audience that you're pitching it to is the C-suite level. How do they respond?
It's an interesting conversation. To be invited in to talk about middle managers in general normally comes from, I'd say 80% of the time, comes from one angle, which is I wish my middle managers would step up and take more responsibility and more accountability. The other angle that we get the rest of the time is we're simply not realizing the potential of our middle managers, and when people are honest with me after a couple of conversations, and we haven't invested in them ever or in the last 10 years.
Well, let's change tack and we'll talk about the elephant in the room. Well, it is in some rooms, not in all rooms. But I know AI has absolutely triggered some fear in some. In your opinion, is that founded?
Yes. Yeah. There's no question at all. This is the first time in my lifetime that I've seen tech offer a really viable, transformative capability. The internet, when it came out, was one that everybody was worried about, and it really didn't touch the sides. It helped enormously. AI, I think, has got the potential to replace every role at every level, or many roles at every level, including the C-suite. So I wouldn't say that middle managers are immune, but they certainly are first in the crosshairs. And part of that reasoning is that because they have been the dumping ground for everything that isn't an executive or an individual contributor, they do have an overwhelming amount of work. And part of the optimist in me is delighted that we might be able to create a manager companion in AI that will do all the junk that they hate, that ties them up. You know, the leave administration, the paperwork, the forms, the reporting, all the stuff that frankly is not leadership the way we like to think of leadership. That's the stuff that an AI companion needs to really hurry up and be brilliant at, and there will be great delight in middle managers around the world.
And that's the language, your language around companion, as a tool that can work alongside you instead of a tool that can replace you.
I think so. And the reason that I say that, Di, is because there are still people doing middle management badly. And if that's all they're doing, then that tool will replace them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was reading only the other day, McKinsey said that by 2030, it estimates 30% of work hours will be replaced by AI, and potentially that could rise to 70% across many roles. And then, of course, the flip side of that is it's creating new roles that didn't exist previously.
So I'm probably going to make a definition between what AI can do now versus what we are all very optimistically assuming and excitedly hoping it will do. One of the things that I've observed AI not being very good at is reading between the lines. So it isn't great at body language. It isn't yet great at picking up patterns of inconsistency between what you're saying and what you're feeling. And I think that's a really important place where humans play a role, and leaders in particular, because we do know that people are leaning more into their manager as a pseudo-therapist these days than they ever had. We don't leave work at work anymore. We haven't done for quite a long time. So your boss tends to play this outsized role that really blurs the line between a person that manages your work and a person that really is involved in your life. I think there's a lot more humanism in the life skills piece than people perhaps give it credit for if you're a good leader. If you're not, then the bots are coming for you.
That's interesting. And your comment around the humanistic side, which AI at this point isn't doing. I'm not sure that anybody's really going to trust AI to be that empathetic, sympathetic ear that they're looking for when they need someone to speak to, or do you see that possibly changing?
There's a little bit of a risk, isn't there? You know, we hear about people falling in love with their
I knew you were going
AI.
there. I knew you were going there.
I'm not going to go any further there. But I do think this is a place where particularly female leaders have an innate advantage. Typically, women are better listeners. They are more empathetic. They are more attuned to the unspoken messages that are coming through, which AI is not attuned to. So I really do think there's a leverage point there that will particularly advantage female leaders.
Yeah, that's interesting. Leverage point or opportunity. So it's up to us to identify how we're going to make the most of that. Yeah, that's a very interesting thought. Well, as we come to a close, I think my final question for today, which possibly feeds straight off that point that we've just discussed, but What would be the boldest thing a woman in middle management right now could do to reclaim her influence, her energy, and in fact her worth?
I think that's a really important question at the moment. So one of the things that I'd see with middle managers, full stop, is that we absolutely know adoption of AI will not happen without middle managers. Now, that doesn't mean that you can rebel against the machine and stop progress, but it does mean that you can choose to play a very influential, very visible role in getting AI adopted in the right places, in the right way. Or you can bury your head in the sand and pretend it's not going to happen. It will in the end. The thing about women in particular in that kind of play, and it does link back to what we just talked about, because we tend to work within our teams more, there's more of a nurturing in the trenches style of leadership with female leaders. We're missing out on an opportunity to be more visible, to be more upwardly influential, and to play more of that, I suppose, hero leadership style, which for most women, myself included, isn't really our cup of tea. Now, the problem with that, if we keep leaning into the in my team version of leading instead of on my team version of leading, the problem with that is invisibility. So women in particular have a real problem with putting themselves out there, with showing off, with being more visible deliberately. They find it quite distasteful. They watch people doing it very badly, and they definitely don't want to be like that person. I would put myself in that bucket. The research that we've done, though, shows that there are 4 things that predict your ability to have more impact from the middle of an organisation. Managing up, managing your reputation, and being prepared to deliberately influence people are 3 of the 4 things. So visible is valuable. Women are going to have to get out of their own way in order to bring all of that leverageable extra skills to this particular story about AI.
That's interesting. So if there is a listener who hasn't yet accessed a previous episode on the podcast, The Power of Visibility with Karen Eck, it would be worthwhile listening to that episode and going back into our library, because that is the perfect example as to what you're just talking about, Rebecca, of this whole issue of women not being visible enough, and what they need to focus on is in fact elevating that, even if it doesn't come naturally.
I'd say especially if it doesn't come naturally, because if it doesn't come naturally, and I would say for about 80% of women it doesn't, then hoping that you'll do it by accident is not a strategy.
I'm finding that with social media. Is it the same thing?
Quite similar. Yeah, really quite similar. There's a very natural distaste in the female psyche for pushing yourself forward, for dominating a conversation, for interrupting people, and whether this is at a boardroom table, at a barbecue, on social media, doesn't matter. There's a real resistance, and frankly, I like it. It's good manners, but we weren't conditioned that way. And it's not to say that we want to bring some of the negative leadership traits that are more 80s, macho style leadership, the alpha style, which I think has definitely gone the way of the dodo, thankfully. But we really do have to bring ourselves. We have to be present. It is no longer acceptable to be a leader and to be invisible.
How does somebody find you if they want to engage your services, and in particular if they want to explore this B-suite strategy and look at that internally in their organisation, Rebecca?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Well, I'm everywhere, Di. Everywhere.
You're visible.
Yes, visible, right, and valuable as a result. So you will find me if you look up B-Suite Leader anywhere. You'll find me on BoldHR's website, boldhr.com. You'll find me on LinkedIn. So there's nobody else doing the B-Suite thing. I would love to see more people doing the B-Suite thing. It really, for me, is quite an important movement to move away from middle management, to shed that really horrible reputation. and move into something far more proactive and impactful. So feel free to borrow that phrase. Whilst it's trademarked, I will not chase you. I will probably chase you to thank you.
And I would love, and I have to congratulate you, because coining that phrase and taking that to market, I think, is a stroke of genius. And I would suggest how busy you are actually reinforces that view. So well done. Well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for your brilliant questions today.
Oh,
really
you're
brilliant.
most welcome. Thank you so much to our listeners today and joining us on this episode, because I think the middle manager is an unsung hero, and I think, as we pointed out earlier, they are the engine room of most organisations. And Rebecca and BoldHR have so very, very strategically shone a spotlight on this group, and I think we'll all be for the better as the leadership from the middle elevates and pushes their influences further and further upstream in organisations. So be sure to share this episode with somebody within your leadership cohort and your peers, because I think this is an invaluable episode to help somebody think strategically about how they're going to manage their career. And as Rebecca said, you can find her on her website. You can find her by looking up B-Suite, because she's coined that phrase that will take you to her on the internet. And also it will be included in our show notes, and you can find all the details of this episode and others on my website, powerofwomen.com.au. Be sure to follow, be sure to share, and be sure to like. Until next time.